Where is Argentina heading? In November, Argentinians elected Javier Milei as their next president. His election is a protest against the country's failed economic and monetary policies. Milei is 53. He is the first elected president in Argentinian history who describes himself as an anarcho-capitalist. His goal is to end the downward spiral of the Argentinian economy with risky policies. For instance, Milei says Argentina is not in a position to have its own currency because inflation is uncontrollable. He believes the central bank robs the population when it uses notes.
You know what? Yes, I'm going to end the central bank because it's the origin of inflation. That is, it's the little machine that prints money. Do you know why I'm going to end inflation? Because it's the way in which you steal from us. Do you know how much the government stole from us with the monetary emission in more than 20 years since we left convertibility? $280 billion.
During his election campaign, Milei made two controversial proposals: the dollarization of the Argentinian economy and the abolition of the central bank. But how's this possible? And how realistic is this plan? How would these proposals be implemented? And what are the obstacles Milei will face? Stay with us. We'll give you the context. Argentina's economic outlook is bleak. The South American country is in the midst of one of the worst economic and social crises since it returned to democracy around 40 years ago. More than 18 million people are estimated to be living in poverty. That's 2 in 5 Argentinians. The Argentinian peso is one of the world's worst performing currencies. Annual inflation reached 143% in October. It's the highest in 3 decades. Javier Milei's promise to fight inflation, the greatest of all evils for the Argentinians, convinced voters and propelled the populist to victory. Milei says he plans to blow up the central bank. He blames it for the devaluation of the peso and as a result for the country's rising poverty.
We're going to dollarize the economy. We're going to close the central bank. We're going to have to put an end to the inflation cancer.
But just how realistic is it to shut down an institution like the central bank?
In principle, it's possible for the central bank, like any other bank, to go through a liquidation process. In short, liabilities are repaid with the assets, and everything that remains is handed over to the investor. The investor of the central bank is the Ministry of Finance. It's the government.
Strictly speaking, closing the organization would not be feasible, since it would require, let's say, political support in parliament to be able to do so. That is to say, in principle, it is a measure that has never been tried before, and that responds to other types of laws.
So, how does Milei intend to break up the central bank?
So what can be done, and this is the last thing Milei's economic advisors have said, is to try to reduce the central bank's room for maneuver. You can try to do that, but it's very unlikely that you can abolish it as an institution.
For Milei and his economic advisors, the dollarization of the Argentinian economy is a necessary condition for taking power away from the central bank.
So if you close the central bank and abolish the pesos, that will de facto lead to dollarization. The question is which currency will have legal tender status for Argentina. We are thinking of the US dollar for 2 reasons. First, it's already the currency in which people save. Argentina is de facto dollarized, not de jure. The second reason is that the government issues international debt instruments in dollars. So if the dollar is legal tender, the government charges the same currency it has to pay. This eliminates the problem of an exchange rate mismatch between the currency I charge and the currency I have to pay in.
Here's a reminder of what abolishing the central bank and a complete dollarization of the economy would actually mean. The US dollar replaces the Argentinian peso as legal tender. As a result, Argentina loses control over its own money supply. The government would no longer be able to increase revenues printing more currency. The central bank would cease to be the lender of the last resort, and it would no longer be able to control money supply to respond to shocks and fluctuations in the economy. So how can a country dollarize its entire financial system while dollars are scarce? During his election campaign, Milei said the switch to dollars from pesos and paying the current debt would amount to $35 billion. He believes that cost could be covered by reserves and bonds held by the central bank. But Milei's critics say that if he wants to borrow part of this amount, it would mean taking on new government debt.
Well, if there are no dollars for dollarization, you can't dollarize, right? We are talking about an amount of money that an economy the size of Argentina's receives when it presents a serious, consistent plan. If you go to an international organization and say, lend me dollars and I will see what I can do, they won't give you anything. But if you say, this is my plan, it works like this and this, in detail, that's something else.
Exchange rates played a major role in previous government plans to stabilize the economy. Before Milei proposed dollarization, Argentinians have had one big fear: the rate at which the economy would be dollarized.
How many pesos do we have to give to get $1? If the exchange rate is very high, the consequences for the country will be extremely negative, because that will mean that Argentina will be much poorer in dollar terms, and the income of Argentinians, measured against the dollar, will be very low.
The dollarization rate is theoretically the reference or average exchange rate on the day the dollarization takes place. Analysts usually assume that this is approximately the value of the dollar blue, that is the black market rate. It also depends on the rate at which the dollarization is carried out, whether it's done in December or April. Depending on when it's done, you will have a certain value. So you can't give a specific number because it depends on when you do it, but conceptually speaking, it depends on the day you do it.
Argentina would follow 3 countries in Latin America that have made the US dollar their legal tender: Panama, Ecuador, and El Salvador.
When Ecuador was dollarized, there was a period of 9 months for the exchange of sucres, the banknotes, into dollar bills. After 9 months, the sucres were no longer valid. El Salvador did things differently. El Salvador said that colones never lose their validity, so if you want to use them in the country, there is no problem. And these are 2 possibilities for dollarization. The currency changeover in Ecuador took 9 months. In El Salvador, since it was voluntary, it took 2 years.
The experiences of El Salvador and Ecuador with regard to dollarization were experiences that lasted several months. So we will have to wait and see what this policy looks like when dollarization is combined with the closure of the central bank in Argentina. It's about both together, so we don't have a clear idea of how long it will take.
What's known about Milei's plan to dollarize the Argentinian economy? Well, it makes it one of the most radical and complex financial operations imaginable for our country. And it's likely to encounter both technical and political obstacles.
I understand that in financial technical terms it can be closed. And in legal terms, Argentina is also able to say, no, I do not have a central bank anymore. So in that sense, I see it as feasible. More difficult is the political part. Congress could pass a law to close the central bank. But it seems to me that the biggest challenge is political, rather than economic or legal, if you will.
It requires majorities in Congress that don't exist today, let's say in a legal sense. They would not be forthcoming, so it would be a very complex issue.
It is also worth noting that it's not the president but the Congress that has the final say on Argentina's monetary policy and the central bank's fate. And Milei doesn't have a majority in parliament. But say he did manage to overcome that challenge. What would happen?
Today, Argentina has an annual inflation rate of 130%. I think moving from that to the inflation rate of the USA is a big step forward. When you have a disease in the system that affects the entire economy, then eliminating inflation in general is an improvement for the entire market.
The goal of reducing inflation could thus be achieved. However, the problem is the economic and social consequences that will arise in Argentina, which could be devastating, as has already been the case in Argentina in the past, with measures that were not as strong as this one, but were more of an interim solution. That is why we have crises in Argentina every time a policy of this type is adopted, and there has always been deterioration.
Experts are already sounding alarm bells. Among them, U.S. investment bank Goldman Sachs, which warns that Argentina needs a sound macroeconomic policy environment and fiscal policy discipline to attain sustainable growth. But that's not a given. Goldman Sachs says that dollarization could be very painful without fiscal discipline. So can Milei dollarize the economy and abolish the central bank? Well, it's not just about implementing a radical policy. Javier Milei also needs to get his opponents on his side if he intends to change the rules of the game while adhering to the Argentinian constitution. It's one thing getting voters to pick him on election day, but he may now need to campaign for his policies with Argentinian lawmakers if he wants to see them through.